Welcome, everybody. We'll get started in just a sec. So excited to have you joining us. All right, welcome everybody. We'll get started in just a few minutes. If you could introduce yourself in the chat, that would be great. Awesome. Team, should we get going? Cool. Okay. I love webinars that start with music. It's always nice to groove a little bit before we jump into the meat of the conversation. Just wanted to say good afternoon to everybody. Thank you all again so much for joining us for the launch of the Resourcing Resilience Report. We are so excited to share these findings with you and really kick off the work to move these recommendations forward. Together, we envision a collective funding environment across both government and philanthropy that creates the conditions for every community in California to have the resources that they need to build long-term climate resilience. My name is Kiran Kumar, and I am the Director for Climate and Disaster Resilience at Northern California Grantmakers. I am really lucky to be joined by our close partners across Philanthropy California, at the Nonprofit Finance Fund, and at the California Office of Emergency Services. We've put together today a program that's going to walk folks through the key points of this report, and then we're also going to hear from a group of incredible thought leaders around what this work really means for them and how they're moving efforts forward around elements of this report. Before we jump in, we wanted to provide a little bit of background on why it is this report even came about. Philanthropy California's work in the climate space really began by organizing funders and coordinating with government around disaster response. As is pretty implicit with vulnerable communities, we found that we were organizing response year over year in the same communities. And as anybody who's done work in disaster knows, while the response phase is sometimes the most exhausting, the most difficult aspect of the work really comes in the months and the years after as communities recover and try to build some sense of resilience. At the same time that our disaster work was growing, with the influx of federal funding in 2021 and 2022, we saw that it was the communities that seemed to be more resilient to disasters that were the ones who were able to quickly turn around and attract this funding. Alternatively, it was the same communities that struggled to respond and recover from disasters that saw this funding pass right by them. So in a world where there was suddenly unprecedented funding to achieve resilience, it was only the already resilient communities that were able to access these dollars. In other words, communities are getting stuck in a perpetual cycle of response without additional deeper intervention. And while it's pretty easy to be hand wavy around things like capacity building, we wanted to understand more specifically what conditions need to be met within communities and from the ways that funding is structured to enable communities to really break out of the cycle of response into proactive, long-term, community-owned strategies around climate resilience. And then also, given our respective audiences and our long-term partnerships, both with the philanthropic and the government sectors, we wanted to provide tangible recommendations around what each sector can be doing, both individually and catalytically, to really help communities level up. Hence, the Resourcing Resilience Report. It's also really not lost on any of us here today that we're launching this report in a month where we've seen funding completely halted and the promise of future movement on these issues stalled. Our take, which is inspired by the communities who helped inform this report, is that we have to take the long-term view. We know that there's broad economic, social, and political support for climate resilience. So we're likely to see funding continue to support these efforts down the road. And so what I'll say is that while it may feel really difficult and challenging right now, communities are not taking their foot off of the bike pedal. If we walk away from supporting communities to build readiness and establish the foundation for resilience, we run the risk of perpetuating the same issues that we saw previously, where historically underinvested communities are underprepared to take full advantage of opportunities that are meant for them. So I'll hop off my soapbox now, but I just wanted to offer up a sense of hope that this report can be inspiring, informative, and really ignite some collaboration and action amongst folks on this call and with your partners. It's been let me tell you, it's been a real labor of love to bring this report forward with our partners, and we're just so excited to share it with all of you. For the agenda today, our colleagues at the Nonprofit Finance Fund are going to walk us through the report, and then we're going to transition really into conversation, first with a CBO partner panel, and then followed with conversations with both public and philanthropic funders. I think that's it for me. I just, again, want to reiterate how excited we are to launch this report, but also to be doing it with all of you thought leaders, practitioners, folks on the very front lines here. So it's really a collective effort. I think with that, I'll pass it back over to you, Jackie.
Great. Thanks so much, Kieran. So I am Jackie Doherty. Hi, I'm a member of the consulting team at Nonprofit Finance Fund and one of the co-authors of this report. So I'm going to start by taking a few moments on the methodology that we use before digging in on findings and recommendations. So to put this report together, we reviewed existing publications and reports on topics that intersect with what we're talking about here today. And as you read the report, you will find references to these throughout the body. After that, we then conducted interviews with about 24 stakeholders from across California, including folks from government, philanthropy, intermediaries, and on-the-ground perspectives. And where allowable, interviewees were compensated for their time. With all of that information and all of these perspectives, we put together a report in collaboration with Philanthropy California and presented draft findings and a draft of the findings and recommendations back to a group of our interviewees to confirm and clarify what we were putting together here. So we want to give many thanks to everyone who participated and contributed to this project and those who contributed to the body of research that came before it. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to start walking us through the barriers we identified, starting with access barriers. And we're going to kick it off with capacity. Accessing public funding is not easy. Groups with limited resources have limited time and money to devote to the onerous and at times highly technical application processes that these funds require. Knowing this, many never try. Capacity begets capacity, and those who have accessed public funding before, as Kieran mentioned, they're often better positioned to apply again, while those who haven't had the resources to engage are often left out. Next, we're going to move on to coordination. If a nonprofit is required to apply collaboratively with a government agency, which we saw a lot with some of that more recent federal funding, both parties need the capacity and the resources needed to engage in the process. Not to mention the pre-development work it takes to build alignment on priorities, on project scope, and on execution. In particular, rural, tribal, and otherwise under-resourced communities, both in terms of government and nonprofits, are less likely to be able to devote the time needed to this process or to meet the tight timelines that these opportunities often require. Next, we're going to move on to communication and trust. So the relationship between community nonprofits, tribes, philanthropy, and local, state, and federal government can be extremely fraught, given the history that has brought us to where we all stand today. Effective collaboration between funders and communities requires trust, and that trust must be built and earned to make effective solutions. For example, funding programs designed without community input often do not adequately meet community needs, or they include unrealistic requirements and expectations, which makes for less effective projects and it erodes trust. In particular, we want to highlight that there is a widespread lack between philanthropy and government, an understanding around tribal communities in particular, their structures, customs, decision-making processes, treaty rights, issues relating to sovereignty, and so on. And that's an area where additional learning is especially needed. And with that, we're going to move on to our next category of barriers, which is implementation. And we'll begin with working capital. So under-resourced communities are far less likely to be able to amass the working capital that's needed to be able to afford to wait for reimbursement. And as we're seeing in heightened ways right now, the risk that folks take on when spending money first and waiting to be reimbursed, that can be substantial, and the amount of time can be unpredictable. Advance payments help, but they're not yet being universally implemented. Next, bridge financing is often touted as a solution to this issue, yet opportunities to access that financing, they're limited. And the weight of interest payments, that in and of itself is a barrier for those with limited resources. Having to pay interest in order to be able to even access public dollars, particularly when repayment timelines can be lengthy and unpredictable, it's just not a viable option for many. Moving on to reporting and compliance. So the high level of administrative burden that comes with government funding is another barrier that came up repeatedly. The costs can significantly outweigh the resources that are permitted for overhead in many cases, and this is an area where there's just not enough additional flexible dollars to support for folks that are working with really limited resources to begin with. And then finally, while some funding opportunities do come with technical assistance, we heard from many that the one-size-fits-all approach that is commonly used often does not meaningfully help organizations navigate the complexity or the breadth of the many issues and needs that they end up running into. And so with that, we're going to move on to our third and final category here on barriers, which is around sustainability. So first, project-based funding, it can be great for getting something up and running, but without adequate resources for that long-term ongoing support, they can absolutely languish a few years down the line. And we see this take place repeatedly in the boom and bust cycles of state budgeting in particular, where funding streams for climate-related projects are often cut in those lean years. Next, of course, and building off of this, recent events have highlighted how threats to federal funding can impact communities in so many ways. And climate resiliency projects are in no way immune to this. The investments made during the last administration, they're very unlikely to be sustained with federal dollars anytime soon. Next, volatility. So within the disaster cycle, there is wide variation in the levels of resources available for immediate recovery from disasters. It varies disaster by disaster based on circumstance and who's affected. And there's substantially less funding available to support the long-term recovery and resiliency efforts, which are also tremendously needed. And then finally, with philanthropic giving, that has its own trends and cycles of change that can also leave projects without support for that long-term sustainability that's really needed. So those are our barriers. We're moving on now to our recommendations, and we've got these 5 listed here, and I'm going to walk through each of them briefly. So first, we're recommending that funders in this space strike more of a balance between rapid disaster response and longer term investments in resilience. For the long haul, uplifting success stories is going to be critical for maintaining and restoring public support for this work. We've got to celebrate the wins and show people how communities succeed when they're in the driver's seat. Next, folks need more access to information about funding opportunities, and they need more flexibility and more time to apply and to carry out this work. One strategy that came up several times from folks we spoke with was the idea of earmarking funds for under-resourced communities, and that this can make a huge difference in communicating to these groups that they stand a chance and give them the time that they need for their particular circumstances, which again can really vary based on who we're talking about here. Funds are very much needed for capacity building and for pre-development. And finally, wherever possible, the use of advanced payments can make a massive difference in the accessibility of these funding programs. Moving on, investments that support community wealth and well-being, they're needed. The way that climate change shows up is markedly different in different communities, and the solutions needed, those are going to vary widely. The best people to inform those solutions and the people who should benefit from them ought to be the people living and working in those communities. Community benefit agreements and plans, they're models for how communities can be involved in determining their futures in meaningful ways. Also, preparedness, recovery, and resilience funds are especially needed. Next, we have the opportunity for more collaboration and more sustainable funding models. For example, California communities, they want climate to be considered a critical element of the state budget and communicated as much by passing the $10 billion bond last fall. But there's much that can be learned and achieved by coming together across sectors to support all of these goals as well. Sustainable commitments are needed to support that relationship building that's needed to really strengthen communities and get projects ready for funding. That's relationship building, learning, responsiveness, and collaboration that's needed. All of that takes time and needs support. Also, as needs change over time, funders can make a big difference by being responsive, and that includes responding to changes in the availability of public dollars. Finally, significant repair work is needed. Under-resourced communities face the heaviest impacts of climate change, and they have the fewest resources to address it because of the long history of disinvestment, discrimination, and exploitation that has benefited many of the institutions that are now in a position to invest in climate resilience, including in philanthropy and government spaces. Take accountability and engage in repair work with the communities who most need your institution's support, and design your funding and your work to make it possible for them to engage and to succeed. So, the report, it includes a lot more detail on all of these points and also uplifts many success stories that we hope will inspire readers to consider new possibilities for how they might contribute to a more equitable funding landscape for climate resilience now and in the years ahead. So with that, thank you. And I'm going to pass the mic now to my colleague, Bree, who's going to take us into the next portion of this webinar.
Thank you so much, Jackie. I'm actually going to be joined by Sam Carter from Resilient Cities Catalyst and Beatriz Camacho from Undocu Fund. And so we really want to talk about how barriers are showing up and the work that they're doing to be able to support these communities to help and bridge some of the gaps. So I'm going to start with you, Sam. Jackie just talked about some of the different barriers that we heard about during our interviews. Can you introduce yourself and your org, and then tell us from your seat, what are the biggest systemic barriers preventing historically marginalized communities from accessing resilience funding, and how can organizations like yours help bridge those gaps?
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Bree and Jackie and the Philanthropy CA team. Just right off the top, I want to say everyone should read this report. It's really interesting, and it's very resonant with a lot of the experiences that I've had working not just in the California context, but nationally and internationally, in fact. But I'm Sam Carter. I'm a principal and founder of a nonprofit organization called Resilient Cities Catalyst. We work in the US across almost all states. We also have an office in Europe, and we work internationally. And we run sometimes large programs with multiple funders, sometimes government funders, sometimes philanthropy. Those can have dozens of different countries involved. But we also do on-the-ground work, very tactical work. And in the California context, we've been working for the last 4 years through a program called the California Resilience Partnership, where our organization is trying to create coalitions and partnerships to work on climate resilience at the appropriate scales. Oftentimes that's a regional scale or at the kind of watershed or landscape scale. And it involves pulling these different types of actors together, government, nonprofit, community-based organizations, so that they can draw down funding, so they do have the capacity to do the work that's required in this very unusual time that we're in. The report was really resonant for me. There are 3 kind of main themes that really resonated with the work that we're doing. The first is the challenge in the need to embed and integrate resilience thinking in long-term planning and in project design. Resilience thinking is a relatively kind of new topical area and technical, and it, by its definition, it's interdisciplinary, and it requires doing things differently and in ways that cut against the traditional ways that places work and the ways that people collaborate in. So just to give you one example, I'm sure many people on the call are following the all the different conversations that are happening around recovery and the Los Angeles wildfires. Very complicated space. Every day you read about a new process that's being announced by another billionaire, or kind of a new layer of government that's announcing a new effort. All, I'm sure, very well intentioned, all coming from places of genuinely wanting to help. But the kind of one of the culminating actions of all this is a kind of rush and a desire and a feeding into a very natural response of homeowners and community leaders of just wanting to jump right back to rebuild what was already there. And I think one of the challenge of doing this type of work is in these moments, how do you interject or kind of disrupt some of these normal conversations in a way that's constructive, that meets communities where they are, that acknowledges their very real and valid emotional connections to what was there before the event, and at the same time inject some new thinking, thinking about how to use the resources that are and will become available to actually move to a new paradigm and move to a place where communities are safer, they're less exposed to some of these risks. It's just a very real challenge. And it requires like different types of collaboration and different ways to integrate resilience into all the different pieces of work that we do, whether it's transportation, housing, other types of practices represented on this call. The second main barrier and challenge is lack of capacity. And this was already spoken to by Jackie, so I don't want to go on it too much. But in the way that we do our work at RCC, we are not just, trying to kind of move projects forward and get things done and kind of achieve community scale impact. We are also always trying to increase the capacity of our partners. So even though a lot of the work that we do ends up feeling like advisory services because we have a lot of technical capacity on my staff and on my team, we're actually trying to teach our partners how to do the work. We're trying to leave behind a legacy of greater capacity through every one of the partnerships that we're doing, so that the kind of work our organization has been doing isn't necessarily needed in the future. It can be done by our local partners. And I think for all of us, all the work we do needs to have that component of capacity building as part of it. We need to be educators, we need to be trainers, we need to be coaches. And that's different than the way we work sometimes, where there's just kind of a pocket of expertise over here and you draw it in and then you kind of put it back where it was. We need to really be thinking about spreading that knowledge and capacitating all of our partners, because there's just not enough people to do this work. We need to be building a big team to do this. The third thing is a lack of quality TA, and I'm trying to choose my words here. There's a lot of TA out there. So there are a lot of people that will provide technical assistance. I'm sure everyone on this call has worked with TA providers. You've probably been a TA provider in various ways. What's hard is identifying and sorting through what are the quality TA providers, and what are the more kind of, I'm not going to name names, what are the kind of generic consultants that might be out there now kind of selling themselves as resilience and climate experts. And because there's that gap in capacity, because there's that gap in such extreme need and such extreme demand, there's a lot of folks, kind of pouring into the technical assistance space that may or may not have the experience to work in meaningful ways with community-based organizations and actually help them achieve their goals. That's a good thing in the sense that there's kind of a more mature market developing around resilience, but it also makes it really challenging for community-based organizations to sift through all the different types of expertise that's available and really get what they need in order to advance their community goals. So I'll leave it there, but thanks so much, Bree, for the question.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for sharing those 3 points with us. Beatrice, I'm gonna now ask you, is there anything that you would like to add to what Sam has already offered? And then, of course, we would love to hear about the unique challenges that undocumented communities are facing and when it comes to accessing disaster relief and resilience resources, and how UndocuFund has worked to address those gaps.
Yeah, thanks, Bree. Similar to Sam, as I was hearing a recap of the report, just thinking about how it all resonates with what we're experiencing on the ground and doing this work. As mentioned, my name is Beatrice Camacho. I use she, her, ella pronouns, and I'm the director of UndocuFund. We're based out of Sonoma County in Northern California. And when we created UndocuFund, it was meant to be a mutual aid project providing direct financial assistance to immigrant families impacted by wildfires. Since then, we've expanded our work to include additional climate-induced disasters and COVID-19. And in the last 3 years, we've shifted to work year-round and include organizing efforts, really recognizing that immigrant communities are disproportionately affected by disasters and need access to resources and stronger protections to be able to thrive. I want to emphasize that disaster recovery must be equitable, and that means ensuring that immigrant and mixed status families are not left behind. We know that immigrant families, communities, face significant barriers in accessing relief, including but not limited to language barriers, fear due to legal status, and restrictive eligibility requirements that all too often exclude them from government aid. When we created UndocuFund, we knew that the most effective way to address these gaps was to center the voices and the needs of the people most impacted. We couldn't have started this work without our partnership with grant makers concerned with immigrants and refugees, knowing that they had the resources to get us started administratively. From the beginning, our approach, it's really been rooted in trust and cultural competency and community leadership. We have an intake process that's designed with care, asking the right questions in a way that is accessible and trauma-informed. UndocuFund ensures that immigrant families are receiving direct financial assistance without unnecessary hurdles, which we hear too often from folks when they're trying to access other resources. We have become a model that has been replicated across the state and across the country. And beyond financial aid, we work to build long-term resilience within immigrant communities by integrating organizing, education, community healing into our efforts, by organizing Know Your Rights workshops, connect families with resources, host healing clinics, and engage in policy advocacy to push for more inclusive disaster relief measures. Just last year, after 7 years, we co-leading a campaign that passed a disaster eviction moratorium ordinance for Sonoma County during declared emergencies, the very first ordinance of its kind. It was just last week enacted due to atmospheric rivers that we're experiencing. So we're working to shift and change systemic issues as well. Our work is guided by folks most impacted. Decisions are made collectively with leadership from trusted community members who understand firsthand the challenges immigrant families face. And sometimes that takes a little longer. Since our inception, individuals and philanthropic organizations, many of who are on this webinar right now, have generously contributed to our efforts, allowing us to distribute $17.5 million in direct assistance to Sonoma County families impacted by disasters. However, to really drive lasting systemic change, we need sustained multi-year unrestricted general operating grants. The challenges we tackle are deep-rooted and require long-term commitment. Change doesn't happen overnight, and in our current shifting landscape and escalating climate-induced disasters that compound existing hardships, flexibility is really essential to be able to do this work. We must be able to respond rapidly and effectively before, during, and after disasters, ensuring that communities receive the support that they need when they need it the most. And honestly, through strong partnerships and networks of care, we are proving that collective action and community solidarity are stronger than the fear that's meant to divide us in this time. And in a time when disasters are increasing and immigrant communities are under threat and continue to be excluded from traditional relief efforts, organizations like ours are not, just responding to the immediate needs, but we are shifting the narrative around who deserves to recover. And our work is a testament to what happens when we're able to be in coalition and come together and to really ensure that nobody is left behind.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Thank you for naming the importance of the need to make this more equitable and to ensure that the communities that are really impacted have access. I really want to thank both of you for your time and for sharing the ways in which your organizations are working to fill these gaps. I hope that we're able to circle back and hear more from you later in the discussion. But for right now, I'm going to hand it over to Jess to be able to lead our panelist discussion with funders about their work in this space.
Fabulous. Thanks, Bree, and thank you so much, Beatrice and Sam. Look forward to continuing the conversation. Hi, everyone. I'm Jess LaBarbera with Nonprofit Finance Fund. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. I am thrilled to bring into the conversation our colleagues from the state, Wei-Fei Mok from the California Strategic Growth Council and Sabine Talugan from the California Environmental Protection Agency. So Faye, I'm going to start with you. Thank you so much for your time. And if you could just introduce yourself and share a few sentences about your work, we'd love to then have you talk a little bit about how the Strategic Growth Council sees, but also endeavors to address the impact of inconsistent state climate funding, particularly on communities that are trying to implement climate projects and solutions.
Yeah, great. Hi, everybody. My name is Faye. My pronouns are they and them. I'm the Deputy Director of Equity and Government Transformation at the Strategic Growth Council. So part of my portfolio is overseeing our programs that help deliver technical assistance and capacity building. So I wanted to highlight some of that work for here today. A lot of those programs are trying to address making funding access more equitable for California. And so as it was highlighted earlier in the webinar, we know that communities do have difficulties being ready and having capacity to have the infrastructure investment. And so a lot of the fundings that we have under the Community Assistance for Climate Equity, or the CASE portfolio, is to develop out upstream capacity building technical assistance for communities to be able to offer a longer runway for people to be able to fund staff, to help to understand what the landscape is, to develop more expertise around what even the type of options are for projects, so that they can be able to really think about like what their community needs are, and build the partnerships they need for particularly like more complicated grant applications. And so within the case portfolio, we have 4 specific programs that are targeted to specific audiences. So one is for tribes under the Tribal Capacity Building Program. We currently have 1 round active right now that got kicked off last week. Another is for local governments in underinvested areas. We're in the 3rd round of that program Boost, currently in Imperial Valley. Another is for regional collaboratives focused on being able to help communities be able to build partnerships in that collaborative structure, again, so that they can have more of an infrastructure to be able to work together at a sub-regional level. Currently in the 1st round of that. And then lastly, another program called PACE that focuses on community leaders, again, building their expertise and capacity there. So all of these programs were really designed with community and taking their needs and the feedback in consideration for the program guidelines, and really specifically being very, very flexible in the type of curriculum and the trainings that they can offer, so that whatever kind of topics or specific project needs that came up, that funding can help to address that portion. So another program design I wanted to highlight as well is around the holistic and wraparound implementation funding. So the idea is that for folks that graduate from our capacity building programs, they can then apply for something like the Transformative Climate Communities program or the Community Resilience Centers program, TCC, CRC, that many of you probably know of. These 2 programs are examples of really holistic and wraparound implementation funding at a more neighborhood scale that offers just more flexibility for folks to be able to, again, tackle whatever kind of projects or needs that appear. We know that climate often has very many different types of facets that other state funding might be too siloed to be able to do. And so many communities end up having to do go after very piecemeal in a project way. And so the TCC and CRC is designed so that we can tackle multiple projects at the same time. And specifically also offering funding targets within our applications so that we can get a more diverse set of applicants across California in terms of geography, as well as specific set-asides for the priority populations. And just lastly, I wanted to highlight our work in terms of advanced pay. This was spearheaded by my predecessor, Kieran, when he was in my role, that helped to support the state legislation for having advanced pay for both now nonprofits and federally recognized tribes. While there has been great demonstration of that proof of concept and helping to develop out templates, there still are difficulties in terms of implementation, trying to help other agencies to gather those best practices. So now I am collaborating with Sabine and other colleagues at Cali PA, CDFF and Caltrans to be able to kick off a interagency advanced pay meeting next week, just to gather, state practitioners working on various advanced pay programs so that we can better share with each other, what's everybody working on, what are the collective needs and gaps, and how can we collectively not have to recreate the wheel and then continue to build buy-in on having advanced pay. So with that, I'll pass back to Jessica.
Faye, thank you so much. And thank you for highlighting the work around advanced pay. I think that's really been a huge advance in California's ability to address some of the barriers that were raised. You're talking about sort of a positive action at the state level, and I want to just continue that momentum for a second. I think a lot of our attention right now, rightly so, is on the federal cuts and the threats to federal climate funding. But at the state level, we do have a robust California climate commitment, and as was referenced earlier, the new statewide climate bond. So, I know it's early days, but if you could talk to us a bit about the importance and the potential impact of that $10 billion state climate bond, we'd love to just get some thoughts and bring Sabine into the conversation as well.
Yeah. So just very quickly, my internet was cutting it in and out, so I apologize if I am stuttering. But we're really excited to be able to continue forward with the climate bond. This passed with a majority at the last election, and so it really shows the ongoing demand for climate investment and the ongoing support. And so we can be really excited about having this implementation funding and being able to support programs like TCC, CRC, the extreme heat. Those are some of the programs, at least from the SGC and the Office of Land Use and Climate Innovation side, that will see some of that implementation funding in the coming year for communities. So we're in the beginning stages of gathering all of the program leads, and hopefully we'll be able to start the distribution process in the coming year.
Thank you, Faye. Sabine, would love to have you introduce yourself and share a bit about your work at Cal EPA, as well as your work at First Nations. And maybe to that end, would love to just hear a bit about your prior work and supporting tribes to access public funds.
Yeah, thank you. Haku. My name is Sabine Talogan. I'm Samala Chumash and use she, her pronouns. I'm currently serving as the Deputy Secretary for Intergovernmental Relations, which includes tribal and border relations. And I'm also the Public-Private Partnerships Liaison for Cal EPA. The regulatory boards, departments, and offices under the Cal EPA umbrella include those that regulate air, water quality, pesticides, toxic substances, recycling and recovery, and environmental health hazards. I've been in this role since August, but previously I worked with tribes and Native community organizations in various capacities, mostly doing policy work, including at First Nations Development Institute, where I was a program officer for the California Tribal Fund, which I think a lot of people on this call are familiar with. But if you aren't, the California Tribal Fund supports tribes in California, of course, in their work to steward land, water, food systems, and cultures. This work's led by Rebecca Tortoise, who ensures that the grants are trust-based and focused on building relationships and not adding burdens to tribes and tribal nonprofits, who have a lot more important things to do than focusing on grant reports. Beyond that, the California Tribal Fund and First Nations spend a lot of time educating other funders, both private and public, about the history, the contemporary realities, strengths, and challenges faced by tribal communities. Of course, starting with tribal sovereignty, but also, that tribes know the land and the relatives known as natural resources best. That Native people in places like California have seen multiple waves of physical colonization and forced assimilation and are now working diligently to revitalize their cultural practices and traditional ways in that process, and tribal sovereignty in that process must be respected. Also, that tribes get work done in a different way, often with significantly lower capacity, with maybe a few council members or staff wearing a lot of hats to get things done. And then sometimes the work looks differently because there are some creative ways of, funding work that might include tribal enterprises. But going back to the trust-based grant making, I really want to highlight that the California Tribal Fund is providing general support funds, for example, to non-federally recognized tribes that may be receiving their first grant after getting their nonprofit status. The fund is filling in the gaps for administrative needs because of admin caps or contracting caps or match requirements on public funds. And we have to acknowledge that tribal work has become a little bit, in vogue lately. And so there is a public recognition of the expertise of tribes, meaning the state and other governmental entities want to fund their programs, but program funding does not address the lack of capacity for the efficiencies that public funders usually expect, which creates a missed opportunity for building capacity. And that's something that the California Tribal Fund is trying to address with their small but mighty shop. And they do all this while advocating for private philanthropy to do more of this, so that do more of the capacity building work, so that tribes with low capacity can do more and do more sustainably.
Thank you so much, Sabine. So, I mean, just to sort of recap what we've heard so far, you know, both of you have spoken to ongoing efforts around capacity building and improving, you know, access to funding. You've spoken, Sabine, to the importance of general operating support from yet another perspective of building capacity within tribes to enable greater efforts and impact against the work that they are doing. And you've both spoken to sort of efforts to educate and collaborate. So, you know, lots that we want to celebrate here. Sabine, I just want to ask you one other question in terms of your work now at Cali, PA. You have spoken to us about some of the efforts that are being undertaken in light of the federal climate to really ensure that state funding is as accessible as possible. Could you just share a little bit more about some of those efforts with the group today?
Yeah, so with my background working with philanthropy and nonprofits and tribes, I'm very aware of the challenges that state grants present. And in my current role, Cali PA receives feedback on our grant programs from our Tribal Advisory Committee, from tribal and nonprofit partners who work with us on various projects like community science, and through our public comment periods for grant programs. And what we're trying to work on right now is the very early stages of pulling together our EJ and tribal liaisons, as well as key grant managers, to really start making a good faith effort to coordinate so that we minimize these challenges and, frankly, the corrosion of trust that we create by only applying feedback to one situation or grant program and requiring our community organizations and tribes to keep repeating themselves. So the plan is to start with some of the themes that have been elevated to us and coordinate to ensure that we're really discerning the difference between a statutory requirement that must be reflected in a grant application or management process and something we're simply doing because that's how we've been doing it for years. A lot of the themes and issues that we want to address are reflected in the report. So I'm super grateful to have that document and be able to share it with people as a reference. I wish that, you know, this effort was not, you know, because of the federal administration change. But, you know, in my experience, educating colleagues at the state and building relationships so that people are comfortable enough to ask questions about why this process may be burdensome can go a long way in these bureaucracies, as hard as that may be to believe. I also just want to acknowledge the intersection of philanthropy and public funders. We both bear the responsibility of the public interest, maybe one of us a little bit more than the other, but the nature of our work, you know, is different. And I think it's important that we figure out ways to continue to collaborate so that we as in, you know, public funders, as in the state, can benefit from really the reflection and intentionality that are represented by, for example, like the funder conveners that are putting on this webinar and creating this report. But I also think that philanthropy can benefit from the knowledge that public agencies have by being super keyed into specific issues. We all have a really long way to go, but I have faith in our ability to do good work despite the circumstances. And in this case of like what I'm talking about right now, it's a little bit because of the circumstances, because of this administrative transition that we are trying to make some changes. So.
Sabine and Faye, thank you both so much. And we're going to invite you back into the conversation momentarily. Folks, we are going to shift gears now to talk to our philanthropic partners. And as we make that transition, I also just want folks to begin to think through what questions you might have about what you've heard so far. We've heard a tremendous amount about the efforts of local organizations, of collaborative efforts to move towards resilience, of the public efforts to build capacity and address some of the barriers that have been raised in our report. And we're going to now hear from some of our, the members of Philanthropy California, some of our philanthropic partners here in California who are addressing these barriers through their own responsive action. So would invite questions, would also love to hear what we're missing. What else is happening on the ground? Where else are there opportunities for collaboration? So get those juices flowing. And, you know, in the interim, I will invite our three philanthropic funders to join us for this last part of the Q&A. So Kai-Ying Hang, who's the president of the Center for the Sierra Health, the Center at Sierra Health Foundation, excuse me, and senior vice president of programs and partnerships at Sierra Health Foundation. Welcome. Lil Tesfaye, who's the director of program development at the James Irvine Foundation, and Christiana de Benedict, the director for environmental initiatives at the San Diego Foundation. So thank you all for taking the time to join us. Kai-Ying, I'm going to start with you, if you don't mind. If you could introduce yourself, share a couple of sentences about the work of the center, and then also if you could just talk to us about the center's efforts to partner with government as well as other philanthropic funders to really support CBOs to access public resources and address many of the barriers that have been raised thus far.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Jess. Can you hear me? Okay, good. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm so delighted to be part of this conversation, particularly to be in this segment with my colleagues, Christiana and Lul, who we've done many work together. So I'm thankful if I were able to share a podium, it is with these two wonderful women. So I'm delighted. Let me just quickly introduce myself again for those of you who I don't know. My name is Kai-Ying Hang, and I actually wear two hats, just as Jess said. I serve as the Senior Vice President for Programs and Partnership with the Sierra Health Foundation, and I also serve as the President of the Center of Sierra Health Foundation. And so a little bit about who we are, for those of you who don't know who Sierra Health Foundation and the center is. Sierra Health Foundation is a private health foundation we were created 40 years ago with a mission to assure that all Californians have a healthy life. And in 2012, we created a philanthropy adjacent organization, an intermediary called the Center of Sierra Health Foundation. The center aims to bring people and ideas together across the entire state of California. So we have an explicit focus on health and racial equity, and we're unapologetic about it. So at the Sierra Health Foundation Center, we are huge fans of public-private partnership because we know that the work of any one sector, whether it's government, philanthropy, or nonprofit, is inadequate for what we can do together. So that's why I'm so thankful to have been asked to be part of this panel and really want to celebrate the work of Philanthropy California and the Nonprofit Finance Fund for your work on resource and resilient report. It's going to be huge in terms of field building. Today, I've been asked, as Jess said, to share a few examples of how we've empowered community-based organizations to partner across, to partner to, I would say, both obtain and retain, right, public funding, and therefore scale mutual impact as a result. So let me start off with our work around the COVID Services Insurance Innovation Fund, CSIF. This came about during our work in managing the state's largest, and I would say because of the size of California, right, the country's largest COVID education outreach campaign. And in it, it became really clear for us that while COVID mitigation and saving lives requires massive commitment to public-private partnership, and that means bringing together diversity of community organizations, state agencies, business, and philanthropic partner, that was key. That was key because if we are going to be able to reach community members who needed accurate, culturally relevant in-language information, all the things that our friends from UNDOC Fund talked about, we needed information that would be able to help inform decisions about the safety of families and communities impacted. But what we learned very quickly as we were dispersing those funds in partnership with the state by way of FEMA was that many of our more smaller, more grassroots nonprofit organizations, partners were unable to access federal pass-through dollars. So what did? We created the COVID Service Insurance Innovation Fund. We brought together Cal Nonprofit and Cal Nonprofit Insurance, and we created a fund to help these smaller nonprofit organizations access the type of insurance that they need and receive the appropriate technical assistance and training to understand why it is important for them to have coverage for workers' comp, for professional liability, for cybersecurity. And in providing small grants to them, then we eventually funded 36 organizations who asked for support, and that came to the tune of close to 200,000. But those little kind of access to resource helped them to build their organization's capacity, so they were able to receive these pass-through FEMA dollars for the immediate time. But now it is part of the organization's operation, so that they are now prepared to receive other public sector dollars that may require, as you all stated in the report, high reporting and compliance requirement, right? And then let me talk about another example, and that is that post the pandemic, we created a partnership, and Lul is a partner of ours, called the Community Economic Mobility Initiative. Because it really became clear to us through COVID that the communities that were most deeply impacted, disproportionately impacted, were also communities who were living in distressed community, lower socioeconomic, didn't feel like they had an opportunity to really embrace the green economy, climate resilient, inclusive economic development. So what we did was we aimed to build a strong nonprofit network around climate resilient and inclusive economic development, initially to draw down federal resources, federal infrastructure dollars, and to give them the best chance in order to be able to submit competitive proposal. Now we know that those dollars may or may not be available anymore. Chances are probably not. And so our commitment to building the community's capacity and nonprofit capacity continues to be just as strong. So let me talk a little bit about what are the three pillars as it relates to our CME work, or the Community Economic Mobility Initiative. So it included capacity building, technical assistance, and power building. So since 2022, since the launch of the initiative, we funded 52 organizations combined. That's $15.3 million out the door to support their capacity, in essence, to pay for their participation in learning what it means to prepare themselves to go after some of these public sector dollars. And to do so is to make sure they have access to first-class training technical assistance. That's 110 one-on-one hours of coaching by the teams of Dr. Manuel Pastor and Dr. Chris Brenner from USC and UC Santa Cruz. I mean, they wrote a book on solidarity economy, right? And so who better to prepare our community partners than the folks who are out there talking about this. And then last year, we launched the third component, which is power building, with the belief that in this moment, we've got to be prepared, but this moment cannot end, that it is, in fact, we're building a momentum, right? It's not just the moment, it is building a momentum to sustain the movement. So what does that mean? So that is about building constituency that can withstand any barrier. So that's where we are in terms of our CME work. Let me just talk a little bit, because we all like to hear about return on investment, right? So the early return on investment is that we were able to help support a Sacramento-based nonprofit organization who primarily serves the Latino community here, to leverage a CME grant of $125,000 into a $17.8 million federal EPA grant for their capital project to reduce pollution and build climate resilient in historically underserved Latino primarily neighborhood in Sacramento. Further south in SoCal, City High CDC received $3.3 million from California's Air Resource Board for bike and pedestrian infrastructure connected to affordable housing, with some state money from CME. Lastly, let me just offer another example that really brings to light, right, what it means for what climate resilience looks like in community. So in addition to the IRA, IIJA, and other infrastructure funding, whom I know many people on this call are very familiar with, probably much more than I am, the Biden administration also launched the Justice 40 initiative, which at the end of the day, it's about making sure that 40% of available public dollars flow into communities that have not in the past received their fair share of public dollars. And as such, we were able to help leverage $500,000 from HUD funding secured through our congressional representative, Congresswoman Doris Matsumi. And along with that $500,000 commitment is a $400,000 us and the NBA Foundation to support the launch of the net zero mobility. At heart, it is about showing the community what climate resilience looks like. It's introducing green jobs to young people by offering on-the-job training for installing EV chargers and creating ride-share program with these EV electric vehicles, right? And this is an example of what can happen when public-private partnership work. Climate equity is seen on the ground. Oftentimes, community says, "What does this mean?" And so we're offering that. But it's hard to say because the community is still waiting on HUD's resources because a lot of that's still being held up in this larger conversation. So in conclusion, what can I offer you in terms of some takeaways? So the first thing I'll say is for us as a health foundation, health is not just about healthcare, right? But it's a wider social context. It's where we live, work, pay, and pray. It's about economic mobility, educational access, environmental justice, and much, much more. And for us to be able to tackle all those, we need to do three things. One, work with communities who are closest to the issues, and many of the previous presenters already spoken to that, because we believe that they're the best, they hold the best solution. And by doing so, the second thing is we have to be committed by building their capacity, directing resources, offering training, technical assistance, and advocating for policy system change. And that our trusted relationship with the communities can serve to scale them. That leads me to my third point. Leverage our own resources and capital. That's us. I'm speaking to my foundation colleagues and peers to bring people together. I mean, we reside in a fairly privileged or sweet spot, right? In that we can bring folks together across sectors. We often can serve as a neutral convener. And at times, we may have to offer up our own flexible dollars to shore up these pilot projects that can be scaled with public dollars. So I'll stop here. I may have taken too much of my time, and I'll pass it over to my colleagues.
Pei-Ying, thank you so much. I mean, you raised so many important points there that speak to just the themes raised in this report and what's needed in this moment to enable greater access more equitably across communities. So thank you for the work that you're doing. You teed us up really nicely for Christiane. I'm going to invite you into the conversation because Pei-Ying, you spoke about leveraging the power that we have and the positional power and the capacity. Christiane, I would love if you could just share with the group more about the work that you have done at the San Diego Foundation to step into an intermediary function, enabling access to state and federal grant dollars into your community. And if you could talk a little bit about the motivations for and any of the early lessons from that.
Absolutely happy to. Thanks, Jess, and thanks for having me part of this powerhouse group of leaders and change makers and all the things, because it's really wonderful to be in this community. I also just want to acknowledge and thanks to the Nonprofit Finance Fund, the Philanthropic California, the report is fabulous and really resonates with so much of our experiences and our work. And so, I'm just really pleased to also play a role, have a part of it, and have a call out in the report, speaking to our role as an intermediary organization, and happy to share a little bit more about our experiences to date. I'm Christiana de Benedict. I use pronouns she, her, and Senior Director at the at San Diego Foundation, managing our environmental initiatives. I've been with the San Diego Foundation now just coming on 4 years, started in COVID, and feel like we're at a new time and a new moment now, but really excited to be working in the intersection of both managing philanthropic dollars and also public funding. And so the San Diego Foundation is a place-based funder. We are a community foundation. We serve the San Diego region. We are 50 years old. We're in our 50-year campaign. And our environment program, which I'm very proud to say is our longest standing program within the foundation. So in this last few years, we have been working closely with one of our community partners, and I think that's really where our journey started, at least for our environment team and the foundation. The Environmental Health Coalition is a long-standing advocacy organization, primarily serving the Barrio Logan historic barrio areas. They have been advocating for environmental social justice since the 1980s and are well known within the community for the work that they've done. They've built a level of trust within the communities and deep relationships. And I think that that is a really critical piece that put them in a position to receive a planning grant from the Transformative Climate Communities round 5 round. And at the time, we're looking for support typically for those grants. And I know we have SGC friends on the call here today too, but typically we have cities step in and be able to lend their support for those kinds of grants. But in this case, the city of San Diego declined, and EHC was in a position looking for support to manage. At the time, it was a $29 million grant, implementation grant that they were working towards. And so we stepped in and we said yes. And I think really a testament to, I see our role not only as a grant making organization, as a financial, management entity, but also, and most importantly, a community partner. And we have relationships in the community and are able to say, to step into these roles, and I think are really was a really important stretch for us. So since that time, and this was 2019, 2020, 2021, and worked very closely together in 2022 and 2023, we did receive word that we were part of the round 5 grantees. And so excitedly, we moved forward working closely with we have 11 partners in the mix. We have 8 projects. Those include 3 transformative plans, a real breadth of different stakeholders involved, from the city to MTS to community partners that have never managed public funding or state grants before. And we've been working together very closely. Much of what I've heard on the call resonates in terms of capacity gaps, challenges. We've stepped in everywhere, every way we can, but always in close communication with our nonprofit partners, really looking to them and EHC, to help guide us in this process. It's been quite a community-driven process from the beginning and continues to be. I also want to just mention that we, because of some gap funding from that initial round of TCC, we were supported by the state, and the TCC staff and SGC has really been a terrific resource for us, bringing in additional technical assistance support. And we went after the EPA Community Change Grant, which we received in July, and that was an additional $20 million to both meet the gap in the funding from TCC, but also provide additional resources for several very well-deserving community projects. And so this has been, both a management of both state and federal funding, getting us to the point now where we are under grant agreements and moving into implementation. So in total, we're looking at an investment that would be over $60 million into the historic barrio areas of San Diego. These are areas that are primarily Hispanic, underserved, have been disinvested in. This is the first time that these grants we've received a TCC grant before. This is the first time a community foundation has served as a lead applicant on these grants. And this is just a tremendous opportunity for our communities and to invest in several different types of projects, from homes, retrofits, zero emissions buses, electric shuttles, workforce development programs, you name it, we have it in the mix. So I think I'll stop there. That gives you a little sense of, where we're at, our role, the work we've been doing, and then happy to answer any questions.
Christiana, thank you so much. I think you did a tremendous job of just painting a picture of what it requires to have this sort of long-term commitment to work in community, and to support bringing resources into community. Lul, I want to just close us out in terms of, again, thinking about how a philanthropic organization can structure its own capacities, its own resources to address some of these barriers in community. And so you all are working on a working capital fund to address some of the payment delays that community-based organizations and tribes face that have been raised. So if you could talk to us a little bit more about the motivation for that fund, would love to just close out there. And then again, welcome any questions in the chat, and have some questions that we will just bring back to the full group. Thanks, Lil.
Thank you, Jess, for the opportunity to be here today and to share a little bit about what the Irvine Foundation is doing. Also, thank you to NFF and the Philanthropy California team for the wonderful Resourcing Resilience report and this conversation today. And also deep appreciation to the other speakers and the equity orientation that you bring to this work. Again, my name is Lul Tesfaye. I'm with the Irvine Foundation, and it's fair to say for the last few years, we've been thinking in many different ways how to support the equitable allocation of federal and state resources for climate and infrastructure. So we've invested $80 million in counting to support capacity building grants, many of which were facilitated through the Community Economic Mobilization Initiative that Kai-Ying spoke to earlier. We've also supported technical assistance, including through Strategic Growth Council's Connecting Communities program. And we've also allocated a fair amount of pre-development dollars to support community coalitions to really design projects that have community in mind and hold the priorities that the most marginalized groups have indicated are really important for their economic well-being and climate resilience. But we recognize that that was not enough. The historic level of funding is incredibly important, but as others spoke to earlier, a lot of community organizations, particularly smaller community organizations, have struggled given the way that public dollars are distributed through a reimbursement model. And as exciting as the advanced pay provisions are, we've heard today that there have been some delays still in getting communities the resources they need to really thoughtfully inform project design, but also project implementation. And so, as Jess mentioned, we were so glad to partner with the Nonprofit Finance Fund to stand up a community impact loan fund as just another tool in this toolbox for making sure that we can see public dollars being implemented in ways that really lead to public benefits and good jobs. And so this is really an opportunity for smaller nonprofit organizations to access at a minimum $250,000 in capital that is at no cost to them. So Irvine is putting in resources to cover the costs of the loans, so interest rates and other origination fees. And we're so thankful to be partnering with the Nonprofit Finance Fund, which is drawing on their sources of capital to make these resources available for organizations that have already been promised federal or a state grant or contract, but are experiencing delays that are hindering their ability to advance the project and potentially experiencing delays that might increase the overall cost of the project for them. I'll just also say, getting community organizations, the working capital is really important, but we're also mindful of the fact that it's an opportunity to provide additional technical assistance so nonprofit organizations can really understand and manage cash flow challenges. We're talking about a really big issue that, quite frankly, cannot be solved with a working capital or a bridge loan fund. And so, we're really grateful that NFF has that expertise and is able to work with nonprofit organizations to address some of the broader issues that are contributing to financial insecurity aside from the reimbursement delays. I'll just highlight a couple of lessons learned, and we're still in this, but what we found is timing is really critical. A loan is not the best option for every single organization. It takes time to approve a loan and to do the due diligence. And some of the organizations that have come to us have needed more immediate forms of capital. And so there are other mechanisms to address those financial concerns. That doesn't discount the fact that a loan is appropriate for some, but it's not appropriate for everyone. The other thing that's really important to keep in mind, I know Karen mentioned earlier, there's some precarity around public funds right now. And to an extent, that's always been the case. Reimbursement rates might change that impact how much nonprofits might ultimately get from their federal or state grant or contract. And so one of the things that we worked with NFF to do was to establish a loan loss reserve in the event that the funding that was expected might not fully come through. There's a bit of a backstop and some additional resources so that under-resourced nonprofit organizations are not left scrambling trying to cover a loan that they fully expected to be repayable because of the public funding that they were promised. So I want to leave time for questions. I'm really grateful for this discussion today and the opportunity to explore these issues with everyone.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for your leadership in this work. To all of you, I mean, I think there's just been such a wealth of expertise and efforts that are being highlighted from all of our panelists to address so many of the barriers that were raised in the report. I'm looking at who's in attendance in this webinar, and I know that there are other folks on the line who are also a party to or leading efforts that are taking place across the state to also, move towards greater cross-sector collaboration, to support community-led efforts to address climate funding. So would just welcome anyone else who's on the line to raise your hand, come off of mute, put into the chat, other efforts that are taking place across the state that you'd want this group to be aware of. Giving folks a bit of time to just, respond to that prompt. I have one final question I would just ask of this group. I think we have a lot of philanthropic leaders on the call, and, I appreciate all of these opportunities that have been elevated for action and response. And I think sometimes what comes up is that we find that, folks can feel that they have to get the buy-in and support from their leaderships and board. And so I would love, Luol, Christiana, Kai-Ying, if there's any way for you to just sort of say, what have been some of your experiences with getting leadership to buy into these responsive solutions and new approaches, any kind of best practices, things that you leave others who are sort of saying, I'd love for my institution to be more engaged in solutions at this time.
I'm happy to jump in on that one. Just because typically, especially for the community foundation, not all foundations or community foundations will take on public funding. But I think we definitely have leadership that's very open and willing to step in, provided that there is alignment with our strategic plan and alignment with the vision of our program. And so I think those were kind of critical questions that we were able to answer from the get-go, and just, work for some wonderful people, and that helps too, getting that buy-in and support. And then to your question on, those new kind of capacities and resources too, that I feel like we're building and leaning into. I think I've shared this before with you, Jess, but we are establishing a line of credit internally within the foundation. And to Luol's points on the reimbursement challenges, we've seen that and recognize that some of our partners will be impacted just because of the delayed timeline and receiving those, those payments. So this is something that, we are working on all the process pieces there, but I think, it's a way that we can lean into kind of our core capacity and provide that additional value to support our partners.
I can jump in here too. I would say that for us, capacity building for our community partners is very much part of our DNA. In fact, when we created the center at Sierra Health Foundation 10 years ago, we actually did a listening circle, a listening session up and down the valley with both our executive team and then our members of our board actually hosted parties, listening parties. And so what we heard loudly is, please just don't give us grants. And then in 5 years, 10 years, when philanthropy changes your priority, then we're left, we're left having to figure out where else we're going to have resources to sustain the work that you're supporting. But instead, build our capacity, help us to be able to diversify our funding source. We know that philanthropy is a huge partner in all this, but philanthropy alone can't begin to make up for all of the needs in the community. And so how do we leverage, how do we build our capacity, how do we engage in our elected official or elected champions, right? And so all of those, all of the things we've heard 10 plus years ago still rings very true for us. And in every of our programmatic strategy design, we keep going back to the guidance that we've heard from our partners throughout the state about how we can really be a partner in advancing the field.
Thank you so much, Christiana and Kaying. So, last call for questions. I have one more for all of the panelists that I will just throw out to the full group here. But, I think we have all alluded to the environment that we are operating in right now, the federal funding freezes and cuts that are, so pervasive across the climate space right now. In light of that, I would love to just hear any sort of closing thoughts, general comments from the panelists or beyond, please. In terms of the greatest opportunities and needs for cross-sector collaboration that we're seeing right now, in light of the federal environment. So if anyone is, sort of has some burning thoughts that they'd love to share with this intelligent and, well-resourced and connected group, I'd love to just invite any of our panelists to come off of mute at this point and share some thoughts before we go to wrap.
I'm happy to step in as an honorary panelist here. Hey everybody, Kieran again. I just wanted to appreciate across our handful of different panels, bringing up some real key tenets of the report that emerged from the conversations we were having with community. Frankly, kind of before the election and some of the federal shifts that we had seen. But we also know that a lot of the feedback, both when we think about the long term, they hold true, but then also given some of these federal shifts, there's some really key important things that we might need to be thinking about, especially from a coordination standpoint between philanthropy and government. I'll stop bearing the lead. The point being that we're likely to see investment in California, but likely through either private entities or potentially even foreign governments, because of the way that the administration may be attracting some additional investment to the country. And because of that, one thing that really stood out to us from our conversations was the need for more systemic, sustained, and long-term funding for community benefits work. We have heard from communities that particularly under the Biden administration in 21 and 22 and beyond, as these projects really started to get underway, it was very difficult for communities to organize just amongst themselves as CBOs around a shared set of priorities, and then to work collaboratively with labor and other entities to then go to the negotiating table. The level of readiness that takes would have required years of investment, flexible resources to really build shared priorities at the community level. And so one thing I just wanted to call forward that was from the conversations we had with community that is incorporated into the report and continues to be a call to action from the field is longer term, more sustainable and flexible resources to enable communities to really get ahead of the conversation around how these mega projects can confer long-term meaningful benefit beyond just kind of labor policies, which are really important, but to co-ownership of outcome and wealth.
Karen, thank you so much for those sage words of wisdom. And I think, you know, again, you said so clearly and well at the beginning here that like this is also a time for us to really hone in on the key findings in the report around where we can level the playing field, where we can invest in disinvested communities, and, you know, use this time to ensure that as greater access becomes available at the federal level, we are setting folks up to be able to access those dollars, to have done the planning work, have done the coordination to support those efforts, and being able to successfully attract that funding in the future. So thank you all so much for your engagement. I'm going to ask our colleague Megan Thomas to come in and close us out and offer some final words of reflection and call to action. So thank you all. Megan.
There we go. I have control of my own voice. It's a great thing. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. What a wonderful afternoon to spend together. You know, the first thing I will say is go read the report or skim it. You know, if you're feeling like it's too much, start one place, read the bullets, and that really the report outlines the themes and the takeaways from today. And it offers some recommendations at the end. So what I'm not going to do is just say those recommendations, right? I won't tell you those. What I want to try and do is sort of draw the lessons that can be learned from the speakers that were with us today. And, you know, I really heard two themes coming back again and again in different forms. And one was said early on, capacity begets capacity. So we all sort of know this, it's a little bit of a truism, but the fact of the matter is, if we want new players to have access to public funds, we have to help them get there. If they don't already have the capacity to do that, they're not going to magically develop it. And so a lot of the takeaways that I have from today is being able to think about beyond a singular project grant, what are the ways to be creative or stretch ourselves as philanthropy a little bit to build capacity, and to do it not just from the perspective of, can I make sure that this one organization is able to successfully apply for and receive this one grant, but can I build up this community so that it has more capacity in the long term to access public funds and to do all the things required to get there, to work together, to have trust, to see the intersectional ways that their climate and community work fits together. One thing that I heard from Kaing was talking about how the Center at Sierra Health Foundation worked with some other folks to create a mechanism for organizations to secure the insurance that is a requirement, a precursor to even applying for these grants, right? So that wasn't about giving an organization money to hit its bottom line. That was about really building in a long-term way for them to be secure as an organization and also meet the requirements of this grant. The other theme that I was really hearing was that reliability and access are key. We heard about volatility. We heard about the fact that in this moment, even folks who have signed contracts aren't certain that they're going to have access to the federal funds. So how do we give community organizations a degree of reliability, a degree of stability that sets them up to be able to use those access supports? You know, and one thing that I've really been thinking about is philanthropy can be reliable. Like, if we did nothing else, we could call up each of our grantees and say, I'm here, I'm with you, I'm not going anywhere, right? Like, doesn't require any new money, doesn't require anything other than just to say, I've got your back. Like, we're going to get through this together. So that's a little off the cuff. But I think that goes to this idea of relationship. And sometimes it's just nice to hear someone say, I see you, I hear you, I care. The other thing is thinking about immediate and long-term, right? Which is sometimes really hard to do, particularly for organizations that are in immediate response mode in a disaster or an emergency. But the fact is, we're not saying every funder needs to do immediate response and long-term recovery work. Collectively, we can figure out where we each fit, and that requires that we're all speaking within philanthropy and across sectors to figure out what the pieces of the puzzle are. And that it's not just, again, about direct funding, but I was thinking about 2023's California AB 590, right? Like, this is a policy that is what made it possible for the state of California to provide 25% of any contract in advance payment that somebody mentioned. That was a huge and sort of game-changing policy shift for state funds. And it happened because nonprofits were able to organize and advocate for it, and get legislators to pass that bill. So just funding community organizing and advocacy is a huge part of all of this. And I'll wrap up since I know that we're at time, even though, as my colleagues know, I could go on and on. I think the last thing I'll say is, you know, with philanthropy, we have some privilege, right? It is, as a sector, we can sit back and think, right? We can say, okay, we need to examine this problem. Generally speaking, we're not under any particular stress or strain or threat as an institution, as a sector. That may not be entirely true right now, but it's certainly distinct from what's going on with nonprofits providing direct services. So let's not do that. Now is the time to say, I'm going to sit back and think about my strategy, but in the meantime, I'm going to put some money out there to support nonprofit. Right? It's not an either or. Like, we can do both and. And at the same time, we do have the ability to think differently, to do that work that Sam talked about, interjecting the long-term thinking into the disaster response, not just rebuilding what we had because it's what is easiest to replicate, but rather taking the moment, taking the opportunity and saying, what would we like to see? And the last lesson is just, every time philanthropy is thinking about how it responds, we're thinking about our own processes. And Sabine said it beautifully, like, we need to not conflate what is statutory, what is required, which for private funders is shockingly little, with what we've just always done. Right. So there are lots of things that we can do. And I think the best way for us to get there is, after you've had your hot beverage and leisurely read the report, reach out to some of the speakers, reach out to the great folks at Nonprofit Finance Fund, reach out to Philanthropy California, and we can figure this all out together, because we have what we need, in this room and among our colleagues. We just need to be able to take the time and energy to tap into it as we move forward for our communities. So with that, I'll say thank you. I don't know if I'm supposed to close everything out or hand it back to someone else, but I'll just keep talking until I get kicked out and say thank you. We really enjoyed having you all here. It's a privilege to work with all these incredible human beings and with you as we do what we're here to do, is create better communities for the people that we care about.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you, everyone. And as Katie said in the chat, we will share this recording. We will share resources following the call. But thank you so much to the panelists. Thanks to those who stayed with us, and have a wonderful afternoon. Look forward to working with you all moving forward. Take care.